After 30 years of hidden life, Jesus bursts onto the scene of history with his public ministry. We go in search of images from that period of Christ's life, from his baptism, one of his miracles, and how he enters then the Temple of Jerusalem. We're contemplating Christ now at the inception of his public ministry, his baptism. Everything that follows comes from this. His preaching, his teaching, his miracles. They will all begin with this very important event of his baptism. And this image is a very precious one here in the National Gallery.
Yes, it's one of the great paintings held in the National Gallery and by the master Piero della Francesca. And it's a wonder of composition. I think it speaks to Piero's skill as a painter, but also his interest in mathematics and geometry and his exemplary ability to convey perspective. And we can appreciate this in the sort of cool luminosity in the setting of this scene.
Yes, I noticed the geometry is very clear, and yet it doesn't, that mathematical orderliness doesn't take away from the natural in the image.
No, it's interesting how some artists choose to hide that, as you say, that more mathematical perspective, whereas I think Piero makes a virtue of it, and we have this very strong sense, particularly of verticality in this image, which goes from the apex of the composition, coming down through the dove and then through the bowl being held above the head of Christ by the Baptist, through the water that comes through down Christ's forehead, in between his clasped hands, down the course of his body, and then finishes in the heel of his right foot. So that's where our eye is kind of centered and drawn, but I think in a very effective way.
And there's a horizontal dimension, isn't there, as well? I suppose theologically it's saying Christ is true God, the vertical, and true man, one of us.
Yes, we have, again, one of these images which is evoking the Trinity. The Gospel account tells us of the dove of the Holy Spirit coming down and the voice of God the Father being heard. So I think exactly that's what Piero is showing us here.
And Jesus is there in his perfect form, the true man, as a true humanity, but at the side of him is John the Baptist pouring the water.
Yes.
John the Baptist historically is a major figure. Josephus, the Roman historian, speaks of him as a colossus. Really, people could have taken him as the Messiah. And yet his job here is to decrease and let Christ increase. And he said, I'm not worthy to undo the straps of his sandals.
Yes, and I think that's close juxtaposition of the figures, but John is engaged with baptism. That's what he's doing. As you say, that's what he's there to do. And I like the way that Piero shows that sort of absorption in his task, and he's wearing that characteristic animal skins, which we often see in art of this period.
And theologically, this baptism of Christ has been a challenge for some. They say, why does Jesus need to be baptized? Well, John asked the very question. I should be baptized by you. Jesus has no sin, so why does he need to go through this? And the response is often given that this is a moment of revelation. It's an epiphany moment. It's a moment when his identity is revealed, because the voice was heard, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased."
And I think that epiphany is what we're seeing here with this beautifully positioned and expertly foreshortened dove that hovers over the head of Christ, telling us of the presence of the Holy Spirit.
And there's just a little bit of gold, isn't there, to indicate the Father, just
yes,
above
just a hint of it. But it's interesting, isn't it, how we're obviously the scene is taking place at the River Jordan, except that it's not. It's taking place, Piero depicts it in a Tuscan landscape, and his hometown of Borgo San Sepolcro can be seen in the background.
And it's making the event again real. It's an event of the past, a memory, but it's also live. And the other reason theologians give for the baptism of Christ is that Christ goes through the baptism as our model so that we will follow him.
Yes, and it's interesting, that point about him being a model, because we see in the background another man preparing to be baptized, so following Christ's model, removing his garments, getting ready for he's going to be baptized by the Baptist next.
And I think that's the invitation of the image in a spiritual sense, that we are that neophyte. We need to go along the same road of Christ through the baptism, but there's a road ahead as well, which is the way of the Christian life.
Yes, and it's interesting the way that he conveys that sense of a road. We come through the waters of the Jordan, but then onto dry land. Christ is standing on dry land. And the lovely depiction of the three angels that stand on the other side of the painting, just waiting there to sort of give Christ his clothes back, but just this sort of sense of presence.
And they have different emotions on their faces. People have speculated what they stand for. And the best interpretation I've heard is that perhaps they stand for the three virtues of faith, hope, and love, which are infused in the baptismal waters into the Christian soul. And they're the virtues we need to follow Jesus.
Yes, and I think compositionally they work so well, don't they? Because they balance this central image of Christ being baptized and bring this great cohesive feel to it.
In the end, this is an image of humility, Christ humbling himself, almost the condition of a slave. He is the Son of God, and yet he is baptized, and he takes his clothes off, just as the neophyte who wants to follow him has to take his clothes off.
Yes, and the vulnerability evident in that, this pale, and the technique that Piero uses to sort of evoke that luminous quality to his flesh, the vulnerability of it, I think, is really striking.
There are echoes of the passion that follows the public life of Jesus.
Yes.
And the contrast, finally, with the figures in the background who we think might be the Pharisees, who were not accepting of either Christ or John the Baptist, and they refuse to humble themselves. They look worldly and proud and go the other way.
And the contrast is even more evident because they're fully dressed and lavishly dressed in rich colours, headdress, in contrast to the near naked depiction of Christ.